Iron Maiden got an awful lot of things right, where we got some things not so right, I guess, but I'm still immensely proud of Test.
They dominated it. But behind the scenes, they made ruthless touring decisions that shattered friendships and destroyed careers. Some choices stunned fans, others ignited controversy. Here are 8 bands Judas Priest flat out refused to tour with and the real reasons why. Trust me, number 1 changes metal history in a way no fan saw coming. At number 8 is Iron Maiden, a rivalry that exploded early and shaped decades of touring decisions. In 1980, Judas Priest were at their commercial peak with British Steel. Iron Maiden were hungry newcomers from the new wave of British heavy metal. The two bands planned to tour together during the British Steel run, but the breaking point came before the tour began. Iron Maiden singer Paul Di'Anno publicly boasted that Maiden would blow the bollocks off Priest every night. The comment struck directly at Judas Priest's authority as established headliners. K.K. Downing later recalled the incident in the music press. I said, "Who are these guys? Why should we have them on tour if they're going to create this type of vibe before we've even met them?" Halford later confirmed the quote in his memoir. He framed it as standard bravado from a young band, not a serious threat. Guitarist K.K. Downing reacted with fury, seeing it as a breach of touring etiquette. Because Judas Priest operated with a strict, almost military mentality, they treated the remark as a threat to order, not simple trash talk. K.K. Downing later said he believed Iron Maiden were trying to challenge Judas Priest and take their place as the top British metal band. That tension followed them onto the road almost immediately. According to Downing, the backstage atmosphere was cold, with little interaction between camps. Things escalated when Iron Maiden appeared uninvited at Judas Priest's rehearsal. They sat in the theater, watching stage moves and set construction. Downing saw it as spying, not fandom, and ordered them removed immediately. That moment became decisive. To him, it confirmed that Iron Maiden did not respect boundaries, but the feud did not end there. In 1981, Iron Maiden again supported Judas Priest on the point of entry US tour. Downing later admitted his reaction was immediate dread. He described renewed tension, perceived disruptions, and ongoing friction. So when the tour ended, he made a personal vow never to tour with Iron Maiden again. That decision hardened into policy, effectively closing the door on future collaborations. Decades later, that early bitterness still mattered. According to former vocalist Tim Ripper Owens, Judas Priest later turned down a co-headlining tour with Iron Maiden. That hard decision of authority makes the next refusal even more painful, because Black Sabbath is at number 7. And this time, Judas Priest weren't rejecting rivals, but their own heroes at the most historic moment imaginable. In the early 1970s, both bands ruled Birmingham's smoky clubs and helped build heavy metal's foundation. At their peaks, Sabbath defined doom-laden darkness, while Priest sharpened speed, precision, and leather-clad authority. Despite shared roots and decades of mutual respect, one modern moment revealed how loyalty and logistics can collide. The story takes place in 2025, when Black Sabbath planned their historic final hometown farewell. According to multiple interviews, Judas Priest were formally invited to appear at the Back to the Beginning concert. Sharon Osbourne personally reached out and offered extraordinary accommodations to make it work. But Judas Priest had already committed to headlining Scorpion's 60th anniversary show in Hanover that same night, so they refused to tour with Sabbath. The refusal was not ideological, personal, or musical. It was rooted in professional obligation and logistics. Rob. Halford explained the conflict directly, saying, "I had no idea this was happening." Sharon said, "We'll fly you in on a private plane, but we're already committed to playing with Scorpions." Halford later explained the decision with striking honesty. "I was absolutely gutted because Sabbath are our heroes, but there were too many variables." So Judas Priest chose consistency over spectacle, honoring fans who already bought tickets elsewhere. That choice echoed the band's long-standing code. They believed in commitment, honored contracts, and avoided chaos. But the emotional weight lingered. Black Sabbath were not just peers, they were heroes. And Halford reinforced that bond by calling Sabbath our heroes, while expressing deep personal regret. Instead of sharing the stage, Judas Priest paid tribute another way. They released a studio cover of War Pigs, framing it as respect rather than replacement. This refusal stands apart from others. It was not born from rivalry or ego, and it shows how legacy bands survive by protecting trust, even when the moment feels monumental. As one chapter closed for Black Sabbath, Judas Priest quietly moved forward with unfinished business. At number 6 is Stryper, a band driven by faith whose beliefs quietly kept them outside Judas Priest's touring circle. Back in the mid-1980s, Judas Priest were reigning as secular metal icons, while Stryper surged as Christian metal's breakout act. At their peaks, Judas Priest stood for rebellion and strength, while Stryper focused on faith through catchy songs and harmony. But despite commercial overlap, the relationship never progressed beyond surface-level awareness. So the refusal emerged as Stryper actively sought legitimacy through association with metal's biggest names. According to Stryper frontman Michael Sweet, his band made direct efforts to tour with Judas Priest. Sweet later said without hesitation, "We tried to tour with Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, and both bands turned us down." This rejection was not about musical skill. It came from a deeper clash over message, image, and identity. While Stryper sold millions of records and filled arenas, Judas Priest chose to keep their distance because their themes did not match. According to interviews, Judas Priest were fiercely protective of metal's secular identity, and touring with an overtly Christian band risked blurring that line at the worst possible moment. So the context of the 1980s mattered, and Judas Priest were under fire from moral watchdogs, church groups, and political organizations. According to multiple accounts, Judas Priest were labeled part of the Filthy 15 during the PMRC backlash, and aligning with Stryper could be seen as surrender rather than defiance. But Michael Sweet later acknowledged the industry reality behind the refusal, and he explained that many bands feared association with overt religious messaging. According to Sweet, it was a different time. Bands didn't want to mix messages, but visuals added another layer of conflict. And Stryper's yellow and black spandex, Bible-throwing stage ritual, and evangelical tone clashed with Priest's darker image. So Judas Priest viewed the pairing as aesthetically incompatible, and they feared alienating fans who saw Christianity as opposing metal culture. The refusal was never publicly hostile. Judas Priest avoided commentary, letting absence speak instead. Stryper became proof that success alone doesn't guarantee acceptance. Once that boundary was drawn, the tension escalated with Ozzfest at number 5, as Judas Priest faced a tour that offered massive relevance if they were willing to surrender control, hierarchy, and stature. In the late 1990s, Judas Priest were going through a period of change, while Ozzfest was becoming one of the biggest metal tours. Judas Priest were a well-known and respected band, but Ozzfest controlled who got attention, stayed popular, and reached younger fans. But that partnership never fully happened when it mattered most. The split quietly began during talks about joining Ozzfest in the late 1990s. According to former Judas Priest vocalist Tim "Ripper" Owens, the band declined an opportunity that could have reshaped their momentum. He said plainly, "Turning down Ozzfest, turning down touring with Iron Maiden. Just little things at the time I thought might have been bad moves." In reality, the decision came from higher inside the Priest camp, and it reflected concerns about positioning, billing, and long-term perception. So while Ozzfest offered massive crowds and younger audiences, Judas Priest hesitated, and the band ultimately withdrew from the proposed lineup before the tour launched. According to reporting, Judas Priest was replaced on the bill without public confrontation, and no press feud followed, only absence. But Owens later clarified the internal consequences of that call, and he explained that exposure mattered more than pride during that era. According to Owens, "I don't know if that was the right move," signaling lasting regret. But from Judas Priest's perspective, the concern ran deeper than visibility, and the band resisted scenarios where they would not fully control presentation and hierarchy. So playing secondary stages or compressed sets conflicted with their identity as headliners, and Ozzfest's structure challenged that status regardless of legacy. But irony followed years later. And when Rob Halford rejoined Judas Priest in 2003, circumstances changed dramatically. In 2004, Judas Priest did join Ozzfest, this time as a dominant force. Halford described the experience as being with old friends, reinforcing the importance of timing. But that return didn't erase the earlier refusal, and it instead highlighted how fragile opportunity windows can be. So the original Ozzfest decision became a case study in control versus adaptability, and it showed how Judas Priest prioritized stature over short-term resurgence. Coming up at number 4 is Venom, an underground band whose extreme style led Judas Priest to keep their distance. In the early 1980s, Judas Priest were leaders in heavy metal, while Venom were rough, underground outsiders. Judas Priest filled large arenas with a polished sound, while Venom shocked fans with loud, aggressive music. But this difference was never a friendly rivalry. It was a basic clash over what heavy metal should stand for. Because of this, Judas Priest chose to step back against Venom. According to K.K. Downing, Judas Priest approached music with discipline and intention, not reckless abandon. And he clearly defined their method, stating that Priest's writing was scientific and built on structure. But Venom stood for the opposite idea. K.K. Downing criticized bands that depended on shock value instead of musical skill. The first problem was musical skill. K.K. Downing also called Venom's sound crude, showing it was not a level Judas Priest supported. Venom's satanic themes caused serious public image problems. At the same time, Judas Priest were already facing criticism from religious groups and moral watchdogs. Touring with Venom could have made that attention worse. K.K. Downing later said that darker images could increase the moral panic around the band. Judas Priest also had strict rules about how they sounded live. K.K. Downing explained that the band aimed for a smooth-sounding overdrive. So Venom's lo-fi aggression conflicted with Priest's insistence on clarity and fidelity, and pairing them on tour risked collapsing those distinctions for mainstream audiences. But there was also an unwritten touring code, and Judas Priest valued hierarchy, respect, and preparation. K.K. Downing said Judas Priest preferred bands that respected the opportunity and understood their place on a tour. Venom's aggressive attitude did not match those professional expectations, so the refusal was quiet but absolute. And Judas Priest simply never opened the door to shared stages. This decision helped Judas Priest protect their long career and public image. At number 3 is Def Leppard, a band that once shared roots with Judas Priest, but whose success quietly changed who they toured with. In the late 1970s, both bands came out of Britain's heavy metal underground, sharing the same scenes, fans, and goals. Over time, Judas Priest became known for a heavier, tougher sound, while Def Leppard moved toward a brighter style made for radio. Even though they once shared stages, the bands soon took very different paths. The split happened in the early 1980s, when Def Leppard began aiming for a much wider audience. According to interviews, Judas Priest saw this change as a move away from what heavy metal was supposed to stand for. K.K. Downing later explained the split by saying Def Leppard became successful because Judas Priest chose not to change their sound to make more money. But that comment showed frustration, not praise. K.K. Downing explained that his problem was not with success itself, but with how that success was reached. As Pyromania and Hysteria became huge hits, Judas Priest chose to keep their distance. They did not tour with Def Leppard during the band's most commercial years. This decision was not based on personal dislike. It came from a deeper fear of losing their identity and being misunderstood. According to Downing, Judas Priest had spent years in the trenches building a heavy blueprint that others later softened. And he believed Def Leppard benefited from a version of metal that was diluted for mass consumption. So touring together risked collapsing crucial distinctions. And Judas Priest did not want to be grouped with what they saw as AOR-driven pop metal. The issue was not only about music. Image mattered just as much. K.K. Downing said Judas Priest had built a darker image that no longer fit with shiny songs and slick production. He later explained that the band had once changed to survive, but now chose not to change again. Competition between their management teams made the split worse. Both bands were trying to reach the same US radio audience, which turned former peers into rivals. Instead of fighting harder, Judas Priest chose to stay separate. They refused to tour together to protect their identity, credibility, and long-term reputation. At number 2, we have WASP, a shock metal lightning band whose controversy pushed Judas Priest to create deliberate distance. In the mid to late 1980s, both bands were at their peak, but they occupied very different worlds. Judas Priest were global metal institutions, commanding arenas with discipline and control. WASP, on the other hand, thrived on outrage, spectacle, and confrontation, dominating headlines as much as stages. That contrast became dangerous as American culture wars around heavy metal intensified. Touring was no longer just about music, it became about survival. According to documented accounts, WASP and frontman Blackie Lawless were prime targets of the PMRC. Songs like Animal and their graphic stage shows placed them at the center of national censorship battles. At the same time, Judas Priest were entering the most legally vulnerable period of their career. They were facing accusations that their music contained subliminal messages tied to tragedy. Suddenly, association carried courtroom consequences. Touring with WASP risked reinforcing the exact narrative Priest was fighting. Their camp feared being portrayed as part of a fictitious rock and roll lifestyle linked to depravity and violence. During the 1990 Reno trial, Judas Priest deliberately framed themselves as four intelligent British gentlemen under attack. WASP's reputation threatened that strategy. Their notoriety aligned too closely with the prosecution's cultural framing, so Judas Priest chose strategic isolation. They refused to share stages with Blackie Lawless during the height of the moral panic. The decision wasn't personal. Rob Halford continued to defend artistic freedom, but the priority was survival. This refusal was about risk management, not rivalry. Touring with WASP would have played directly into the prosecution's case. The distance protected Judas Priest's legal defense and public image. It allowed them to argue they were victims of an attack on freedom, not symbols of corruption. The silence was decisive. And as the trial concluded, WASP remained firmly outside Judas Priest's touring orbit. At number 1 is KK's Priest. And this is the saddest touring refusal Judas Priest has ever made. The conflict wasn't external, it was internal, centered on former guitarist KK Downing. To understand why the refusal still stands, you have to understand what Judas Priest was for decades. Judas Priest wasn't just a band, it was an institution built on non-stop touring, shared ownership, and a unified identity. KK Downing was central to that foundation. He joined in 1969 and helped define the band's sound, image, and rise to global dominance. He wasn't viewed as replaceable. He was part of the core. That changed in 2011. Just before the Epitaph World Tour, Downing resigned. From the band's perspective, the timing felt like abandonment. They believed he walked away at a critical moment and left them to deal with the fallout. The situation worsened when Downing followed up with a second resignation email outlining grievances with band members and management. Any remaining trust collapsed after that message. Unlike Rob Halford's earlier departure, this exit wasn't treated as temporary. Halford, Glenn Tipton, and Ian Hill made a firm decision to move forward without Downing, with no plan to revisit it. Downing later tried to return. According to multiple interviews, every attempt was rejected outright. The refusal was consistent and final. That refusal extended beyond Judas Priest itself. It also applied to touring alongside Downing's new band, KK's Priest. Downing later summarized his exclusion by saying, "I was there at the beginning since 1969. It was my life, my heritage, my legacy, and everything. It meant everything to me." From Judas Priest's perspective, the refusal wasn't emotional, it was strategic. They didn't see Downing's exit as a break. They saw it as abandonment, and that belief shaped everything that followed. The divide deepened further when KK's Priest launched with former Judas Priest singer Tim "Ripper" Owens. Legal disputes over branding and business interests hardened the separation. In contrast, Judas Priest praised Richie Faulkner, who replaced Downing, for his commitment and forward-looking attitude. They saw his presence as stabilizing. Downing was no longer viewed as a brother in arms, but as a liability. As a result, Judas Priest refused any shared tours, any joint appearances, and any reconciliation beyond a single obligation. Even the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction failed to reopen the door. This refusal marked a turning point. It wasn't just the loss of a founding member, it was the moment Judas Priest fully shifted from a band built on shared history into an institution focused on control and continuity. And that brings us to the end of the 8 bands Judas Priest refused to tour with. Some choices were about power, some about survival, and some still hurt to this day. If you enjoyed this journey through metal history, like the video, subscribe, and stay with us, because there are always more untold stories behind the heavy metal.